Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Deku had a split destiny part 1. If you guys enjoy this what if and want to see part 2, comment down below and let me know before I start. Please do support for more awesome content and leave a like, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel and also share this video with your friends and check out the description in my playlist. The author of the story, NatashaBoynton from Wattpad. So let's start the video. Continuing from end of season 3, All Might has been called to meet All for One, AFO, in captivity by All for One's request. Tashinori Yagi, or perhaps you prefer All Might, greeted AFO as All Might entered the room. "You're awfully welcoming today. Using my real name isn't usually your style," replied All Might as he closed the door behind him. "All Might it is then." AFO laughed as All Might seated. All Might was immediately nervous about AFO's goal in this visiting because he had already said so much during his entry. He could see that AFO was very calm but secretly hiding his excitement. "You're incredibly chatty today. Care to fill me in why you asked for me to come here?" glared All Might in slight curiosity. "Tashinori Yagi, how much do you really know about Izuku Midoriya, your so-called successor?" smirked AFO. All Might sighed. "You can try to get in my head all you like, AFO, but he's the one who will become my successor whether you like it or dash. You're talking about my son like he's your own," quickly interrupted AFO. "I told you, you're not going to get in my head ever again. I've already paid the price for that once already," replied All Might, irritated. "The BLD tests beg to differ," All Might sneered AFO, trying to provoke All Might. In irritation of such stupid games, All Might stood up and turned around, disgusted. "This conversation is finished. If you called me here to try and pull on my strings, then you can forget it," he said, walking to the door to leave. "If you don't believe me, you can always find out for yourself. One of your investigator friends took my DNA to a lab, just a phone call away," smiled AFO, watching as All Might walked away, clenching his fists together, trying not to show his anger but fearful feelings. "I can see your hands. Looks like you need to cut your strings. They are still in my reach." All Might slammed the door on AFO after hearing his last few words. He stood still, shaking in unbelievement and confusion. "There's no way Midoriya's son. It's a lie, but it's like AFO to do that, but young Midoriya's. No, is Izuku a spy? What am I thinking? But now that I think about it, he keeps noted on everyone. He knows our fighting styles and weaknesses. He could kill us anytime he wanted to. He has one for all. If will he pick us off? I would have raised the world's destruction. Is it safe to assume he's the good guy here?" Doubts on Midoriya's intentions began to run in circles through his mind, beginning to drive him anxious and fearful of Izuku's potential. AFO successfully pulled All Might's strings with only just a few words. Knowing there's only one way to find out, All Might reached to his pocket to grab his phone. "Howdy doody," laughing face. "Thanks for readin'. I promise, it gets way more interesting, especially at Chapter 4 XD. The next day, Izuku is walking to the UA building. "I wonder where everyone is. Am I late?" he's asked himself, walking alone on the footpath to the UA building. "Midoriya," said Aizawa. Coming out of the building, he stood still and examined Midoriya's body with his eyes as he began to run towards him, looking for any weapons, anything that he could use at any moment to kill or harm. "Mr. Aizawa," exclaimed Izuku. He noticed Aizawa was looking at him strangely, but ignored it. "Where is everyone?" "No one's at the dorms and no one's walking to UA," he asked. "Stop running, stay where you are," commanded Aizawa as he looked away and began to wait. Izuku stopped. "Mr. Aizawa." Minutes later, All Might walked out the doors to meet up with Aizawa. He noticed Izuku had already arrived and started avoiding to look at him, for every time he looked at Izuku, all he could see was AFO. "Hey, what's going on?" asked Izuku, noticing his eyes looking down at his feet as he walked to Aizawa. All Might looked at Izuku after whispering to Aizawa and smiled nervously. "Don't worry, it's nothing big, young Midoriya," he waved. "You can come inside now," said Aizawa, turning away to walk back inside. Izuku watched as All Might turned away to walk back inside, noticing his shaking hands, realizing that there definitely was something wrong. "All Might," he said, running up the stairs, but before Izuku grabbed All Might's arm to make him look at him, All Might turned around and pushed Izuku back, making him fall to the ground, twisting his wrist trying to brace himself from the stairs. Izuku sat terrified and confused. "Why did he push me back?" He didn't do it on accident. He had muscle behind that push. He intentionally. I couldn't have scared him. All Might, quivered Izuku. All Might realized what he had just done and avoided looking at him in the eyes once again. Sorry, young Midori, sorry, Zu. I'm a bit uneasy at the moment. All Might began walking away again, but Aizawa glared at Izuku, sitting on the ground, seeing Izuku a bit unstable from his felt rejection. Idiot, I knew you couldn't keep your composure, thought Aizawa, looking back at them both. He reached out his hand to help Izuku up on his feet. Let's go, Midoriya. Izuku looked down to his feet holding his hand. Okay, he replied. Mr. Aizawa, this is the principal's office. Why are we here? And why are all the teachers here? Exclaimed Izuku. All the teachers in the school were leaning against the walls of the room, mostly around the windows and the door. All will be explained when All Might returns. He'll be here soon. For now, we ask you to sit in the center of the room, replied Aizawa. Izuku anxiously seated in the center of the room, where a single chair was waiting. All Might, so you're finally here, said Aizawa, annoyed. Sorry about that, he embarrassingly laughed. He began to walk to the corner of the room, to then see Izuku, looking like he was about to cry. He was still holding his hand from the stairs. I'm such an idiot, thought All Might. He looks up to me so much. Aizawa interrupted his thoughts. Right, Izuku Midoriya, do you have an intention of killing? Izuku sat befuddled. What? No, exclaimed Izuku, standing out of his chair in amazement of such a question. Are you sure? Asked Midnight. Why do you think I would want to kill someone? Asked Izuku. I'm enrolled at this school to become a hero. Even ask All Might. Izuku looked at All Might in confusion, but seeking assistance in the situation. Izuku, your father is… All Might's voice cracked. My father? What's wrong? Is he okay? All Might, please tell me. Is he okay? Begged Izuku. Izuku, all for one is your father, shook All Might. If that's not. Izuku, it's true, said All Might. Your BLD and his BLD your name, shattered All Might. You all think I'm a killer now, cried Izuku. You have spent years on learning about everyone's quirks and physical abilities, and their weaknesses. A school with heroes such as All Might are easy to study when you're with them, aren't they, Izuku? That's a long way to go, I'll admit, but it's a very sneaky way, something that you would definitely think of. Your muttering is proof of that. All Might stated painfully. Izuku began to panic as the room grew more tense as everyone looked at him in a new way. Everyone was doubting him, surrounding him, cornering him. He knew whatever he said would make him look more suspicious, but what could he say in this situation? All Might was the only one there to help him, but he knew that All Might had already determined what kind of person he could become. His actions earlier proved it. His heart and tears started to run down his cheeks. He yelled. Suddenly, a portal appeared behind Izuku. Tomura's hand grabbed his shoulder and began pulling him into the dark abyss. Thanks, All Might, you made it easy for us now, smirked Tomura. Midoriya, yelled All Might and Aizawa. Izuku looked at All Might running towards him. Get away from me, cried Izuku, piercing All Might's heart. Izuku vanished. Izuku's tears were disappearing into the carpet. All Might stood shocked. What have I done? He fell on his knees in anger with himself, staring at Midoriya's tears being absorbed into the floor. Cried All Might, the one thing that I didn't want to ever do, and I ended up doing. I may be a hero, but I'm no teacher. Hell with that. I can't even be a father. Izuku awoke to the sound of an argument, unknown of his location and not knowing how he got there. He was lying dead flat on the ground. All he could see was darkness and a damp light shining between the crack of two closed doors. AFO can explain everything to me. He said to leave everything to that kid. I want to kill him so much, but I know that it sounds ridiculous, but my emissary knows what he's doing, said an unknown voice from the other side of the doors. Izuku slowly and quietly moved to the doors, trying to make no noise so he could try to peek through the gap. Fine, but if that kid turns on us, I'm leaving your pathetic league, replied another voice. Izuku finally made it to the door unnoticed. He quietly leaned his head to the gap and looked out to the other side. Hey, he's awake, said a cheerful girl who started to walk towards the doors. Izuku panicked as he heard the footsteps getting closer and faster. He used the sound of the footsteps for cover and quickly rolled back into the place where he woke up. The doors were slammed open. Izuku had his eyes shut, trying to make it look like he was still asleep. I thought you said he was awake dash, a high-pitched giggle interrupted. You can pretend to sleep, but you know Izuku, you're cuter when you're actually asleep. Izuku opened his eyes to see Toga, Dabi and Tamura. Toga grabbed Izuku and pulled him up on his knees. Now with light, Izuku noticed he was tightly restrained, his feet and hands were tightly cuffed, chain was wrapped around his neck and his clothes were ripped. Everyone looked at his eyes were full of melancholy and it was almost like they were dead. However, they were still appealing. Your father is my master, all for one. What are your thoughts on that? Asked Tamura, sitting on one of the bar seats. I'm not sure, Izuku replied, looking down with tears forming in his dead eyes. The heroes, your friends, immediately treated you as a villain, didn't they? You're not a hero, you're a villain playing the role, waiting to inject your poison to the students and teachers, isn't that what they said? Replied Tamura, reaching for the hand on his face. Izuku started to tremble. Yes, he cried. Even your hero, All Might, thought that. He rejected you knowing you're really a villain, stood Tamura as Izuku clenched his fists in anger. How does that make you feel? Tamura asked, walking over to Izuku with the hand from his face off. My parents and family rejected me because of my quirk and now I want you to be my successor. Izuku looked up at Tamura. No, how do I know you're not going to do the same thing? He sneered. Because your father asked me the same thing, but if that's enough, you can always ask him yourself, whispered Tamura to Izuku's ear. So what do you say, Izuku Midoriya? Asked Tamura, standing up and handing Izuku the hand that was on his face. Izuku sat quiet. He didn't know who he really was, only his father can explain everything to him. As much as it pained him, he needed to know. Fine, but don't call me Izuku, call me Deku, he said, grabbing Tamura's hand. Good child. Tamura patted Izuku's head with 4 of his fingers. Your father is in a special prison. We know the location of the place but not how deep underground he's being held. Helping him escape is your plan, he's just waiting for you now. Tamura said, taking a seat. Don't worry, I've got a plan, replied Izuku. The day after Izuku's abduction, UA students are to be informed by their teachers of the events that went down yesterday. They have all been called to their dorm's lounge room. You all may be wondering why school was cancelled yesterday, and why I sent you all out to do a cleanup exercise in the city. Most of you noticed that Midoriya didn't join you all. Before I tell you more, can anyone tell me if he has been acting weird? Has he done anything out of the ordinary? Is there something very strange about him? Anything at all? Asked Aizawa, standing in the middle of the room with his arms crossed. Everyone sat confused. Izuku Midoriya? Asked Ida. Something different about him? Asked Uraraka. The only strange thing about him is his huge admiration for All Mights, said Tokoyami. Oh yeah, you should see his room, added Momo. Aizawa looked through Izuku's room looking for something suspicious. The only thing he found was 14 volumes of Hero Analytics. Is that all? Asked Aizawa. I think so. The only other things that are strange about him you already know, replied Momo. He gets all the hot chicks after him, raised Mineta's hand. Aizawa walked out of his room with the notebooks and locked the door. No one is to go inside Izuku's room. It's now restricted. Care to let us know what's happened? Asked Bakugo calmly but with an annoyed face. Oh yes. Do you all recall All Might's last fight? That villain that All Might was fighting is Izuku's father. Izuku was kidnapped yesterday after we told him about who his father really is. Everyone stood in shock. They couldn't comprehend what they had just heard. You're lying, exclaimed Todoroki. Izuku Midoriya is now suspected to be a villain who was trying to kill us off. If you encounter him, do not get involved with him. You must call the heroes immediately. Izuku is a villain, announced Aizawa. Deku, a villain? Bullshit, yelled Bakugo, making the room more tense. Do you think I'd make this up? Asked Aizawa. Where's All Might now? Asked Bakugo furiously. Why does it matter to you? Asked Aizawa. All Might acts like Deku's father all the time, so how the hell did Deku get kidnapped? Yelled Bakugo. At that moment, Aizawa noticed there was something happening between All Might, Izuku and Bakugo, a secret being shared. I'll be back to pick you up later, Bakugo. Just stay here, replied Aizawa, walking away. Uraraka fell on her knees. Deku villain. No, but why? Uraraka began to cry, knowing the one that she loved wasn't the good guy she thought he was. Meanwhile, All Might has gone to meet FO once again. Congratulations Ifo, you got what you wanted, you're killing your own son. I hope you're satisfied with yourself, sneered All Might as he sat down in front of Ifo. Oh, what's this? I've never seen your eyes like that before. Has the symbol of peace been crying? Grinned Ifo. What's going to happen next? It's easy to kill you where you sit AFO, so you better tiptoe your next words carefully. Threatened All Might. Ifo laughed. Wow, I really did hurt you, didn't I? Death threats are very scary when they come from your mouth, All Might. I can just imagine how Izuku must have felt when you turned against him. You said that I was killing my own son. It's actually the opposite way around. The reason that child is alive today is because I knew you would choose him to be your successor and give him one for all. I knew you were going to train him to control his new quirk, but I didn't. Know you were going to take my place and be his father and lead him overboard into the hero side. Looks like he admired you a bit too much. Fo looked into All Might's eyes. He could see the anger and frustration building up in his mind and heart. That gun you brought, that's in your pocket, aren't you going to use it? Come on, do you really think you have the strength to kill someone, All Might? But I guess we shall both see how much anger and emotion it takes for you to finally act. Bakugo Katsuki, do you know the reason why we really kidnapped him? We wanted to see how much he still admired you. You see, Izuku never had me, his father, around, so he would have got lonely every now and then. So instead of asking Inko when I was coming home, he went and to learn things which a father would teach him, but from other kids, he chose to learn from Bakugo Katsuki. The only reason Izuku looks up to you so much is because Bakugo looked up to you too, so even his admiration to you, the great All Mightus. Yo. Howdy doody everybody, thanks for reading this story this far. What do you think? Laughing face. Please, I'd love to know. Happy face. I know I'm not the best writer, I'm sorry about that dash carrot. I love the story so far myself. Oh. 1 week later, All Might is no longer allowed to visit AFO because of his current unstable and emotional state of mind. Bakugo is talking a late afternoon walk. You moron Kirishima. Why do you have to follow me everywhere? It's annoying. Irritated Bakugo, walking down the street, it. I can't go see Inko with him following Medmu Deku, this is all your fault. He thought to himself while he looked to the ground with his hands in his pocket. Kaken, as voice heeded Bakugo immediately. Deku. Where are you, nerd? He yelled, turning around. Yell out to me, you idiot. Dude, you're sure you're alright? It might just be your mind playing tricks. Worried Kirishima. I definitely heard him, you idiot, he replied as he began to jog down the path listening for his voice once again. He ran and ran until he passed an ally with BLD splattered all on the walls. They both looked down to the end of the alley. Bakugo began to quiver. Kirishima, call Mr. Aizawa and an ambulance, he asked quietly. What are you gonna? Asked Kirishima, beginning to walk back slowly in shock. I'm gonna try and stop the bleeding. Meanwhile, All Might sat on the clean steps of the Dagoba Municipal Beach Park. The beach Izuku cleaned and inherited his quirk. All he could think about was Izuku, but when he thought about him, all he could see was AFO. No matter how he thought about him, he couldn't see the Izuku he thought he knew. He didn't know how to overcome such a situation. His salty tears ran from his eyes to his mouth. He had pulled the gun to AFO in their last meeting before being restrained. He knew that he was becoming what he didn't want to ever be, a villain, all because of how he now thinks of Izuku. His phone vibrated in his pocket. He dragged it out slowly. It read Aizawa. He put it up to his ear. He heard Aizawa's voice slightly raised. All Might, Izuku Midoriya has been found. He's in the hospital now and it's bad. All Might stood to his feet. I'm coming. All Might, are you sure? Can you keep your emotions in check? Angered Aizawa, All Might's breath was cut off. Aizawa listened to All Might's silence. If you can't stay easy this time, you won't be allowed to see Izuku either, sighed Aizawa. Thank you, Aizawa, replied All Might, trying to remain calm. All Might walked down the hallway to Izuku's room where Bakugo and Kirishima were waiting. They sat outside Izuku's room. They both acted like they had seen hell, and they had. None of them said a word while All Might walked over to open the door, nor did they even look at him. They were completely frozen. All Might opened the door to see Aizawa waiting at the bottom of Izuku's bed. Every single bone, his spine, almost every rib, his nose, his arms, fingers, wrists, his legs, feet, toes, knees and kneecaps have all been dislocated and broken. His jaw now will lock and teeth are missing. His eyes have had needles, resulting with one eye going to be blind, scaring around his feet, neck and hands we suspect are from being handcuffed. Recovery girl can't even try to help him because he has no energy. What the hell did they do to him to make him this hurt? Aizawa said, covering his mouth in disbelief. All Might tried to hold back his tears, but they wouldn't stop coming. His student laid in a hospital bed, clinging to life only by a thread. They found him dumped in an alley. There was blood all over the walls and ground. We kept the fact that another student had been kidnapped at our school secret, but a targeted child this badly hurt from our school will get out. Aizawa sighed. When will he regain consciousness? Asked All Might as he sat beside the bed. We don't know, he replied. Are you gonna wait? Aizawa asked before turning to walk out. Yeah, I need to apologize to him, said All Might, rubbing his neck. I think we all do, replied Aizawa before he shut the door behind him to send Bakugo and Kirishima home. Bakugo opened the door before leaving. All Might, when he wakes up, we need to talk. All Might fell all asleep next to Izuku, waiting for him to awake. Izuku smiled in his sleep. 12 days had passed. Every night All Might waited for Izuku to awaken, and it was finally time. Izuku woke up to see his classmates leaving the room. Blood sat at his mouth. He lightly coughed, catching the attention of Aizawa, who was them out. Midoriya, he exclaimed, alerting the other students of his awakening. All Might awoke to Aizawa's voice. He looked up at Izuku and saw his lifeless eyes, shadowed with sleep. All the students turned around and rushed back into his room. Izuku looked at them all but couldn't move his head. Do you all think I'm a villain? Whispered Izuku with a broken voice. Everybody shook their heads no. The villains did this to you. They wouldn't do that to another ally, replied Aizawa. Midoriya, what did they do to you? Asked Todoroki at the end of his bed. I don't remember, Izuku said, looking around the room. All Might. Izuku raised his hand while it cracked and began to bleed from his wounds. All Might stood up and held his hand. I'm sorry for being the son of Afo, cried Izuku. I'm sorry for not being your successor. All Might interrupted Izuku. I'm sorry for doubting you. This is my fault. Izuku cried, you're not sorry. You still won't look into my eyes. He looked to All Might, who had his head down, laughed Izuku in despair. All Might cried in silence. Izuku had already figured it out. He wasn't going to let Izuku be his successor anymore. All Might went home like everybody else. Aizawa, however, was asked to stay with Izuku. Can we go see my father? Asked Izuku. Aizawa was surprised. You want to go see your father? He repeated to Izuku. Yes, I don't know if you really do think I'm a villain, so the state I am now shows that if I was planning to do something I couldn't, he replied. Aizawa thought about it for a minute. Okay, I'll fetch a wheelchair. Aizawa lifted Izuku slowly and put him in a wheelchair, and started to make their way to meet Afo. Izuku and Aizawa entered the room. Hello, my son, greeted Afo. Hello, father, replied Izuku with his sickly throat. The room was very tense. Your eye looks really bad, Izuku. What happened? Asked Afo. Izuku sat quiet. Aizawa was standing behind Izuku listening to the conversation, watching Izuku's eyes remain calm as he talked to his father. Aizawa, how were unable to stop my child from being kidnapped while at your school? Teased Afo. Back off, old man, sighed Aizawa. Oh, what a pity. Izuku, you chose to bring Aizawa with you. His quirk is very useful. I'd love to get my hands on it. Laughed Afo. Tell me, Izuku, how long are you gonna play? Suddenly Izuku stood up and activated his quirk. Aizawa panicked when Izuku disappeared from his sight. Izuku scratched Aizawa's eyes, blinding him. Angered Aizawa, holding his eyes to try and stop the bleeding, sneered Izuku with anger in his eyes. Izuku walked over to the glass that separated them both, and flicked his finger to break the glass. Let us go, father, sighed Izuku. Afo stood, and put his hand on Aizawa's head. Your quirk is mine now, Eraserhead. Aizawa began to weaken as his quirk was being taken. Laughed Afo. Let's go, Izuku commanded. Yes, father, replied Izuku. Began to walk away from Aizawa laying on the floor in Afo's cell. Aizawa grabbed Izuku's foot, exclaimed Aizawa, looking up to Izuku, yelled Izuku, turning around and kicking Aizawa in the head. Angered Izuku. Izuku walked away, leaving Aizawa quirkless and wounded. Wow. Thanks so much for reading. It's inspirational to see people actually reading my first fanfiction. And LT3, honestly, I'm getting worried that it's not interesting enough. but I'm trying not to sweat over it too much as long as something interesting happens in each chapter. AFO and Izuku entered the League's hideout, which was located far out of town. Izuku had his gaze down at his feet the way in. He was unsure about what he was doing, but he knew he would be in more danger if he was with the heroes. He had much anger towards them all now. Even if he chose to go back, he couldn't stand being around them. He was in a bind, but his father could save him. Tamura stood up from his seat. They have arrived. FO entered to see Tamura waiting. Tamura, how have you been? He asked, waiting to close the door behind Izuku. Your fight with All Might has impacted the world greatly, he replied, sitting down quietly. What's wrong, Tamura? You seem displeased with the result. Smiled AFO, tilting his head. It's you changing the world. I'm supposed to be your successor. You said that you'd help me with my goal, but you're doing it all without my help. You're the one changing it, not me, irritated Tamura. Oh, I'm glad you figured it out, laughed AFO, grabbing Izuku's shoulder and bringing him close. Izuku, his quirk and mental ability is much more powerful than yours, starred AFO. What's your point? Asked Tamura, turning to stand up on his feet once again. FO smirked. The room went tense. Izuku was still trying to comprehend what he was just asked to do, and Tamura was in a stance ready to attack. You slick bstrd. You adopted me, only to get the attention of All Might, and then I captured your child who would then retrieve you from your prison. Angered Tamura, he suddenly charged at FO, aiming his hands to his face. Lightning flashed and Tamura was on the ground. The longing to protect people, one of the most promising traits of Izuku Midoriya, said AFO, walking over to Tamura. You know, it was his mind who came up with the idea to free me from prison. He did it in under an hour, yet you never thought of how to get me out, did you? Izuku interrupted FO, he cried, tightening his grip more and more around Tamura's throat. It runs in your veins, Izuku, hero and villain. Your reactions are because of your hero personality, saving. You can't stop your hands around his throat because that is you're supposed to be, which is slowly growing, Izuku cried. His grip intensified, beginning to choke Tamura more quickly. Tamura managed to free one of his hands from underneath Izuku's legs, and grabbed his face. Let me go now, brat, threatened Tamura. Izuku sat quiet, smirked Izuku. He giggled deliriously. His eyes looked down to Tamura from between his fingers on his face. Izuku's eyes were different. Instead of dead but appealing, they were lively and serious. Tamura put his middle finger to Izuku's forehead, beginning to slowly decay his face. Izuku pierced through Tamura's throat, grabbing his voice box. Smiled Izuku, ripping out his voice box from his neck. Tamura drowned in his own BLD, lastly seeing Izuku with a delighted smile on his face splattered with his BLD, laughed Izuku, standing to throw Tamura's throat to the ground, splattering BLD to the wall. Izuku, this is unexpected. You're very happy with killing, smirked AFO proudly. Izuku listened to AFO's words and suddenly realized what he'd just done. He cried, falling to the ground in shock, covering his eyes with his bloodied hands. Killing is easy after you've done it once. I shall give you a reward for killing Tamura for me. Aizawa's quirk is now yours. AFO patted Izuku's head. Before I give you his quirk, tell me, one of your eyes is blind as a result of your plan? Your plan was to look like the villains who took you and tried to kill you so that the heroes would believe that you were a hero and not a villain. Was that the only reason that you asked them to hurt you so badly? Whispered AFO into Izuku's ear. Izuku's tone changed. Smirked Izuku, looking back at AFO with Tamura's BLD smothered across his face. Very good, my child, smiled AFO, putting his hand to Izuku's head, giving him Aizawa's quirk. You thought you were taking Izuku to AFO, but he actually brought you to AFO to take your quirk, repeated All Might to Aizawa, who was sitting in a hospital bed. When Izuku moved, his bone cracked. He was indeed intentionally hurt, but to look like the victim, to get our trust in him once again so he could get close to me, his target. Aizawa sighed, thinking of the events which had gone down with All Might. Your quirk is very useful to AFO. I can understand why you were targeted before anyone else, replied All Might, rubbing his chin in thought before being interrupted. Package for All Might, entered a nurse lugging in a long, huge and heavy bag. What the hell is this? He asked himself. All Might reached down to unzip the bag, releasing a horrid stench of death. All Might's voice broke in shock, making him stand back and cover his mouth. he asked, covering his mouth and nose. All Might swallowed. All Might will hate me for killing his teacher's grandchild, his successor killing one of the people he wanted to save most. Izuku laughed. I wonder how that's going to sit on his soul. I'm very proud of you, my boy, replied Ifo. Destroying All Might's or anyone's mind is so appealing. It's the same way I destroyed yours as only just a small child. Suddenly Dabi, Toga, and the others entered the room after being sent to scout for recruits by Tamura. Where's dumbass handyman? Asked Dabi, questioning why he isn't in the room. He's dead, sighed Izuku, looking down at his hands that had BLD in between his fingers. Ifo stood up and left the room quietly. What's happened? Toga panicked. I killed him. Cool your jets, Dabi. You too, Toga, or you'll end up like him too, angered Izuku. Cut the CRP, child. Tamura wouldn't just let himself be killed. Izuku's hand twitched in irritation. Immediately he stood up. Shut your trap. You're telling me that you prefer handyman? Izuku looked at Dabi with intent to kill in his eyes. Laughed Izuku. But your eyes are really intimidating, kid. You better watch that mouth. Dabi's eyes glowed blue and fire began to imitate from his hands. Suddenly his flames disappeared. What's this trick? Asked Dabi, looking down to his hands. You're either with me or with the world I'm going to destroy. Pick a side. Threatened Izuku with glowing green eyes. I don't need a pest, laughed Izuku, slowly stepping closer to Dabi, getting ready to kill him if he chose the opposing side. Suddenly, an explosion began bringing down the building, which was hidden in a forest only an hour away from the city. DKU. Where are you? You nerd. Yelled Bakugo. Izuku rose from the rubble. Rubbing his face clean, yelled Izuku, one thing you wish that you had like I did was a heart as nice as mine, so you wouldn't be angry all the time, right? Bakugo looked up at Izuku, his eyes were covered by his hair. That's why you hated me so much. Out of jealousy, Izuku looked down. You've just killed my only usable members. Great, I was going to take their quirks, you JRK. Bakugo interrupted, he yelled. Bakugo panicked and readied himself for Izuku's attack. You know, my father is a better teacher than All Might. Izuku grabbed Bakugo's shoulder, but when Bakugo turned around, no one was there. What the foo dash? Izuku grabbed Bakugo's head. Knee down before me, Kaken. He smiled lightly. And so he did. What the hell is this? Yelled Bakugo, kneeling before Izuku. You're really dumb. Do you think I spent forever waiting for you to come tear down this hideout? I've collected some quirks while waiting for you, you moron. Bakugo began to cry as he realized he couldn't move from his bind. Aw, tears. Is this the first time I've made you cry? Yes, it is. Wow, it feels good. After all the times you've made me cry. Izuku grabbed Bakugo's skull tightly. Today I'm taking your quirk, tomorrow I'm taking Shinso's, and then Todoroki's, Uraraka's, Gran Torino's, oh so many I can't list them all. You won't wake up for a few days after this. You'll wake up to know that you slept while your friends died. He laughed, covering his face. This his other hand. That you're not a villain, he yelled. Izuku gazed down at Bakugo's fearful face. You're right, I'm not a villain, he said. Bakugo looked up at Izuku in relief. He smiled, crushing Bakugo's skull. Bakugo screamed while Izuku laughed in joy to see him suffer. His skull sounded like an egg slowly being squished in a palm of a hand. The sounds made Izuku deliriously happy. He laughed. Are you going to kill him? Asked All Might, walking out from behind a tree. Izuku stopped and turned around to see All Might all alone. All Might, he stuttered. His grip on Bakugo's head released him and made him fall to his side unconscious, with BLD running down his face from his head. All Might. Izuku began running down to All Might in relief. Not realizing what he was just doing, he suddenly stopped and fell to his knees in realization. Izuku grabbed his head and began to grab it more tightly, as his head felt like it was going to explode. Izuku's personality changed back and forth in front of All Might's eyes. All Might was terrified. Izuku, what have they done to you? Exclaimed All Might, running to Izuku. Izuku, angered, glaring fiercely at All Might. Izuku's hands ran down to his neck, nails pierced his skin, making him bleed. He yelled, putting his hands around his neck as tears began to form. Do you see Izuku's insecurity? This is all your fault, All Might, said Ifo, walking over the rubble of the building to Izuku. Izuku's villain personality has taken over, but not completely. his hero side only lies locked at the back of his head, all because you adopted him to be your son, feeding him of your hero ways. Fo patted Izuku's head as he cried and battled against his own mind. He's on the right path now, he's killed a few people, including young Tamura. All Might stared at Izuku as he sat in pain. Are you satisfied? Asked Afo, rubbing Izuku's head. I've already grabbed Bakugo's quirk. Izuku will dash All Might knee down to Izuku. Young Midoriya, Inko is worried about you, he said calmly with sadness in his eyes. He asked, yelled Izuku, closing his eyes tightly. You've lost him, All Might sighed Afo. Angered Izuku, he sneered. All Might was pushed back by the wind emanating from Afo. Very well Izuku, till next time. All Might smiled Afo, disappearing in thin air, taking Izuku with him. All Might stood to his feet and ran up to Bakugo, who was still unconscious. Howdy doody. Thanks for reading this far. If you'd like to see more Ma fanfiction, then please follow me and keep up with what I do. When I finish this story, I'm thinking about making a villain All Might fanfiction. Happy face. If you're interested, then you know what to do. Thanks. Izuku woke up in a bed to Inko's voice echoing through the house. He couldn't understand what she was saying. He stood up and walked out to the hallway. Mum, he called out. He followed the sound of her voice to a stairway. Making his way up the stairs, he tried to understand what she was saying, but even though he got closer, it just sounded like mumbling. He reached the door where he thought she was, but really, it was just a rooftop. The same rooftop that he asked All Might if he could become a hero. Instead of All Might or Inko on the rooftop with him, it was himself, staring right back at him. Who are you? He asked the person who stood near the railing, who looked exactly the same as he. Heh, are you serious? The boy replied to Izuku, I am you. Izuku stood befuddled. I am the real you, the Izuku Midoriya you're supposed to be. The boy pounced on Izuku with a knife aiming at his throat. I can't do anything if you keep interfering. The boy angered, pushing the knife down closer to Izuku's throat despite Izuku's efforts to hold him back. I'm stronger than you, he yelled. You're not me. Izuku replied, struggling to hold back his knife. We are different people, he yelled. Stop denying the truth, the boy replied, the knife down quickly at a sudden moment, lightly piercing Izuku's throat. Izuku awoke with an headache. The same dream again, he sighed to himself, rubbing his eyes. The foe entered the room to sit next to Izuku while he sat in bed. Father, I want to kill my other, but how do I? He asked, laying down once again. You hate his interference. Replied Afo, did you have the same dream again? Did you manage to slice his throat? He asked, looking at Izuku. No, father, I only pierced it before waking up, he angered. What's holding you back from killing him? We both know you're stronger than him, so you're obviously holding back, questioned Afo. I hate his guts, he's always there in the back of my head, but he is me, the person I believed lived as Afo interrupted him. You're the real you right now, you know that. Yet you're second-guessing yourself. That's understandable. I should tell you the truth, the reason why you admired All Might so much, and why you couldn't defeat Bakugo in a fight till yesterday. Sighed Afo, looking to his feet. Izuku sat up, ready to hear what Afo was to say next. Afo explained how Izuku falsely admired All Might through Bakugo as children. The reason you could never win a fight against Bakugo is because you couldn't be him. No matter how much you learned from him, you couldn't develop a heart with intent to hurt like he does. Bakugo is the painting, but you're the copy, or print. Yesterday, however, the you are now outclassed him easily because this version of you wasn't built on Bakugo. Before I left you, I took you camping a lot. Do you remember? Afo said, standing up, taking a breath as Izuku shook his head no. I took you with me since you were very young. You had only just been able to walk properly. I took you out with me to watch me and participate during my schemes, not to go camping. Izuku went in shock as he remembered all the horrible things Afo and he had done together. He jumped out of his bed and took off his shirt, running to the full-length mirror hanging on the bedroom wall. He turned his back to the mirror and looked back. When you fought All Might's teacher, I was hiding in the rubble. You grabbed me and I pretended that I was a victim to make her stand down. She slowly crept forward toward you, and to show you weren't joking about hurting me, you burned my back and pulled out some of my tendons, exclaimed Izuku, looking at the scars from neck to his hip on his back. She snatched me from you, and then I pierced her with a knife as she held me in her arms, and you finished he off with a final blow. That all happened just after All Might was left the battlefield. Sighed Izuku. Yes, I left you and then Inko nurtured you and you met Bakugo. That's why you didn't remember, replied AFO. Now that you know who you really are, sleep again, and kill the other you, smiled AFO. Izuku entered his bed and slowly drifted asleep, to meet himself on the same rooftop again, but this time, Bakugo sat in hospital in a coma. We can't sit around waiting for Izuku's next move, angered Aizawa. A student could be killed at any moment, hell even now. All Might, if you can't do this then leave it to us. What, you think that you can do something with no eyesight? You're the same as me now, just as useless, admit it. And even if we manage to find them both we can't beat them, we couldn't even save Izuku when he was in the middle of the room that day. Argued All Might. Replied Aizawa, feeling the walls slowly walking out of the room. All Might sighed and picked up his jacket. You're not gonna get anywhere on your own. Stay here. Aizawa replied. Are you kidding me? Asked Aizawa in anger. All Might paused. He's my student, he replied. Then stay here. You're no use to us if you think he's still a hero, sighed Aizawa, but his personality, yelled All Might, which he was trying to keep secret from everyone. What? Asked Aizawa. All Might dropped his gaze. Aizawa knew All Might's statement was true because it's not something All Might would just make up. Either way, he's a villain dash. Aizawa wait dash, angered Aizawa, said Aizawa leaving the room. Bakugo chuckled. Wow, he's really a villain. All Might walked over to Bakugo amazed he was awake. Asked Bakugo looking at All Might's worried and unsure face. He coughed as he sat up uneasily. He asked again. All Might stood in silence. Went through his mind, repeat after repeat. I don't know, he said, covering his head with his hand. A foe got in my head, he got me lost. All Might awoken from his foolishness when he realized that he let AFO in his head before he could get into his. This is all my fault, Bakugo interrupted All Might's thoughts in laughter. This is not your fault, young Bakugo, All Might replied, cried Bakugo embarrassment of his stupidity and immaturity as he were as a child and present, he shattered. All Might painfully watched Bakugo break down. There was nothing he could do or say to comfort him except be there for him right then and there. Todoroki said, entering the room guiding Aizawa with the rest of his class, all bandaged and bruised. All Might and Bakugo looked at everyone in shock. The fact that Izuku had already taken everyone quirks in just a matter of 4 days. All Might's legs shook, he fell to his knees and grabbed his chest with his quivering hands, trying to reach his breaking heart, knowing the fact now, when all of his students stood before him quirkless, the Izuku he knew, that everyone knew, was no more. Izuku sat happily at his desk knowing he had all of his friends' quirks. His father entered the room, catching Izuku's attention as he sat down at his desk on the other side of the room. Are you proud of me, father? He asked, looking at AFO from the corner of his eye. Yes, my son, he lately replied. Izuku started to get irritated for his answer wasn't straight away, slightly showing a lie. Am I your favorite successor? Better than Tamura? Izuku asked another question. Yes, my boy, Nifo replied again, catching onto the bait Izuku had hooked. When can I have all your power? Interrogated Izuku with slight anger in his voice. What's this, Izuku? Are you questioning your own father of his intense science? Asked Ifo. Don't avoid the question, father, chuckled Izuku, turning his chair to face Ifo. Ifo laughed. Ah, I see. You haven't killed anyone in a while. Go out and do so before you turn on me. Izuku stood and grabbed one of the knives sitting on Afo's desk. He turned around and chuckled. You promised me, father. He then quickly turned back around and struck at Afo, but Afo had grabbed his arm before he managed to scratch him. You're holding back, you wouldn't kill your own father? Sighed Afo. Is that because I'm not me? Asked Izuku, panicking. No, it's because you still have use for me, and still second-guessing yourself. Aizawa laughed. Izuku stood down. Just give me what you promised, angered Izuku as he grinned his teeth. Soon, child, I promise. It won't be long now. Afo patted Izuku's head. Meanwhile, UA has been shut down due to the attacks on the students for the last several days. There is no longer any confidence in the teachers when it comes to the safety of the students. All schools across the state have been closed because of these recent attacks. Announced the new reporter. Izuku's next move is obvious. He will be working to bring the faith that citizens have on heroes down. We need to carefully place our next move, said Aizawa to his students. Izuku would know that would be the way you would think, replied Momo. She is right. Midoriya is a very smart boy. He could have already thought of our reaction, added Todoroki. The room was quiet as everyone thought of how they would approach the situation. This is painful. Everything I think of, I don't know if Izuku expects that of us. I'm not sure about anything. He might even know what we will do before we do. Panicked Kirishima. Izuku has done a superb job of making us unsure of our own decisions, sighed Aizawa, rubbing his chin. Think as if you were a villain yourself. What would you do if you were Izuku? Asked Tokoyami. Everyone stood in silence. I'd wait for the heroes to make a move, Momo said. I'd attack the city and draw the heroes in to then kill them all, exchange for something valuable to make the heroes back off, secretly sabotage pedestrians' faiths in heroes, distract and attack, kill one by one off slowly. Everyone shouted out ideas until Aizawa had enough. Stop. If you were Izuku, not yourselves. His eye twitched. Everyone thought of what Izuku's plan would be next. Nobody thought of anything. I don't know, sighed Todoroki. All Might and Bakugo stood up. While you all think about Izuku's next move, we need to pay someone a visit, smiled All Might but concerned. Bakugo, All Might. Where are you going? Asked Uraraka before they walked out the door. Replied Bakugo, using Izuku instead of Deku in his sentence, catching everyone's attention. Inko walked to the door to reply to the doorbell. Inko opened the door to see All Might and Bakugo on their knees before her. Get of my property, warned Inko. Begged Bakugo and All Might. Cried Inko, slamming the door and leaning back on, covering her face in distress, begged All Might. Bakugo raised his head to see All Might. Bakugo was surprised to hear that from All Might's mouth, added All Might. Bakugo cried the more All Might spoke, and Inko stood in shock hearing All Might's words as well as Bakugo. Bakugo grabbed All Might's shirt and pulled him up, angered Bakugo with tears running down his cheeks. He yelled. Replied All Might. Inko opened the door slightly to see Bakugo holding All Might, who had his gaze down to the ground. She replied, holding her mouth in disbelief of All Might's shame. On the walk back to the hospital with Bakugo, All Might thought of Inko's saddened face. All Might. Bakugo stopped his train of though. We both very well know Izuku isn't well Izuku anymore. You think we can change him back to the way he was before? He asked. I don't know, All Might replied, putting his hand on his face, being unsure of anything at the moment due to everything happening so quickly. Bakugo replied with slight cheer in his tone. I don't know. All Might replied once again. Bakugo stopped the continuation of the conversation after All Might said what bothered him. He understood how painful it would be to face Izuku. Oof, howdy doody, 'tis I, the writer. Mwahaha. Now, when I started this story, it was only an idea I had in my mind for villain Deku's origin that I hadn't seen anyone else do, and now it has been a hit. So I turned more into a story XD. I know exactly how to end it, and I'm excited to get to that point in my story and LT3, so don't worry, this story has an awesome ending, smiley face. Thanks for reading. And LT3, All Might and Bakugo returned to the class, who were still thinking of Izuku's next move possibilities. What have you thought of? Asked All Might, sitting on one of the beds. Replied Izuku, leaning at the door entrance with a satisfied look on his face. Midoriya, exclaimed the class and its teachers. Chuckled Midoriya? Asked All Might, walking in front of his students to protect them. He smiled carelessly. Asked Aizawa. He laughed deliriously, covering his face as he blushed just thinking about how heartbroken Aizawa was about to feel. There was so much BLD, she excitedly added, seeing Aizawa's face light up in a panic. He giggled, yelled Bakugo, shoving through the class. His eye twitched when his mood was ruined. He angered, pointing his head up to the roof with his eyes closed. Bakugo started walking to Izuku. Izuku listened to Bakugo as he walked closer. He was pestered by Bakugo. He angered, looking at him, walking towards him with one eye open, but Bakugo ignored him and All Might began walking toward him as well. Izuku's hands twitched. He yelled with an echo in his voice, causing All Might and Bakugo to pause to his voice's strange echo. Commanded Izuku with once again an echo in his voice. Everyone stopped and panicked. They couldn't breathe. It was the work of Shinso's quirk. Izuku laughed, running his fingers up his face and into his hair. He sighed as person by person fell to the floor trying to breathe. Izuku asked himself as he stepped around students suffocating on the ground. He laughed, stepping on All Might's wrist. Izuku pushed his foot down on All Might's wrist. Everyone watched as All Might's hand began to bleed as there was cracks and snaps of his bones breaking. Cried Uraraka, beginning to lose the light in her eyes. Izuku turned behind him to see her face in tears like everyone else. Izuku walked over her with a face full of pity, making Uraraka think that he felt sad for her, but his sad face was only just to get her hopes up. Izuku walked to the door once again. Everyone's faces were sweaty, saliva coming from their mouths and tears out of their eyes. He was only going to let this go on for a little while longer. Smiled Izuku. Izuku suddenly ran to Bakugo as kicked him heavily in the face as he was kneed on the floor. He laughed uncontrollably. He walked back in front of All Might. Breathe, said Izuku, releasing everyone from his bind. Everyone gasped and took in the oxygen. Izuku sighed. He said, rubbing the back of his head in disappointment. Asked All Might, grabbing his dislocated hand. So that society knows that hospitals aren't even safe anymore now that I am here. But also, smiled Izuku, looking at everyone before leaving the room. Several weeks passed, everyone was fully recovered, but Izuku had been busy in the meantime, killing off some pro-heroes. Izuku is preparing for war. I know that not all of you are strong without quirks, so I'm offering you to leave the battlefield to us who still are. When this breaks out, we are going to need all the strength we need. Announced Aizawa, standing before his class with a walking stick. Please leave the room if you will not join us in this fight. We will not judge you, added All Might. Everyone put their heads down and thought about their capabilities. Slowly, many of the students left the room. It was sad to see. Almost everyone left because they all depended on their quirks too much. Todoroki, Bakugo, Shinso, Azui, Ida, Kirishima, and Uraraka. Are you sure? Asked All Might. Yes, she replied, clenching her fists. You all are going to be filled in with our strategy. Izuku has our quirks, so we will be using the knowledge of our own quirks' weaknesses to stand a chance against him. For example, when Aizawa used to look into a mirror, he cancelled out his own quirk, which made his eyes burn and made him immediately want to shut his eyes. If he looked at the mirror again, which would be in front of him, the same thing would happen. All Might reached for his pocket. We will be trying to put these glasses on Izuku. The lenses are mirrors, and once they are on, they will not come off unless you know how to properly flick the SWH hidden in the back. All Might gave each student 2 pairs of glasses. If Izuku uses fire, then find water. If Izuku talks to you, then do not reply. If Izuku grabs you, then do not hesitate to fight back to escape his grasp. Added Aizawa. You hesitate, you die. Aizawa and All Might said together. Meanwhile, Endeavor, Todoroki's and Dabi's selfish father, sighed Izuku as Endeavor walked past Izuku in the streets of the night in the city. Endeavor paused. That voice, Izuku Midoriya. He turned around to see a small kid in a hoodie stopped to the call out of his name. You killed Dabi, he sneered. Correction, Bakugo Katsuki killed him, but I was going to kill him after I used him for all he was worth, so I guess I can still be considered the killer of Dabi as well. He laughed with his back faced at Endeavor. All Might warned me about you. Word says you're the hero and villain killer, not to be underestimated. Endeavor announced. Izuku jumped up and down. Who he? I have a name now. Wow, I'm so happy. My own special name. He giggled, putting his hands back in his pockets. You're the #1 hero now, but you're still a puppy, still behind All Might. Endeavor paused in confusion. All Might gives you warnings, and you note them down. Endeavor's eyes twitched and his flames raged listening to Izuku's taunts. You're still just a child to him, laughed Izuku, dodging Endeavor's flamed punch. That's sad, Endeavor. A child can dodge your punches easier than you can walk. Laughed Izuku, watching him enrage more and more in flames, quickly burning everything without his own notice. Pathetic Endeavor, no wonder why All Might looks at you like a weakling. If you can't kill me right here and now. Endeavor reached out and grabbed Izuku by the throat, burning his neck by his uncontrolled flames and slamming him into the cement floor. I got you. You will never put your hands on Shoto. He puffed, grabbing Izuku tighter around the neck. Izuku bled from the nose and coughed out blood from when his head collected from the impact to the ground. Not too bad, hotheads, he laughed, spitting blood and a tooth into Endeavor's face. You've done what I wanted you to do, he grinned as the hand around his throat tightened. Endeavor relaxed and heard the sounds around him. Fire was tearing up the city, screams and cries echoed for miles, and ambulance sirens were everywhere. Dumbass Izuku laughed. "I'll kill you," screamed Endeavor. "Please do." Izuku begged in laughter. Endeavor put both of his hands to Izuku's throat and pushed down. Izuku watched Endeavor's angered face as he began to gasp for air, grabbing the ground instead of Endeavor's arms to not try hold him back from being choked. Izuku's face started to turn red and blood began to run out of his eyes as well as tears, all in front of Endeavor. Endeavor looked at Izuku's dying face. Izuku's eyes were about to shut, but Endeavor let him go. Izuku gasped and choked, taking the oxygen sitting up while Endeavor sat on his legs. "So you do have a heart," he choked, holding his burnt neck. "Yo, you should show that heart to Shoto," he smiled, laying his head back to the ground. "What are you gonna do now? Save the people who are screaming for help, or stay with me?" Izuku questioned, looking up at Endeavor. "If I let you go, you'll kill more," replied Endeavor. "Their screams will haunt you," sighed Izuku, looking up to the orange glow in the night sky with a sad smile. "Go save them, then tell All Might to meet me at his statue," ordered Izuku with the use of Shinso's quirk once again. Endeavor stood up off Izuku and began to walk to the nearest voice. Izuku stumbled up, still dizzy from being thrown to the ground. He watched Endeavor walk away before he hopped with his sore leg uneasily in the opposite direction. "I've been tired lately, so if spelling is wrong somewhere or a sentence doesn't sound right, then I apologize. Can I please get some opinions on the story?" Laughing face. "Is it interesting? Which chapter do you like the most? Your favorite moment so far? Please let me know." And LT3 thanks for reading too. And LT3 and L3 and L3. Izuku sat down puffing and bleeding. He leaned himself up against All Might's statue. "I'm sick of this," he said to himself, rubbing the dry blood off his forehead when there was flames, death and destruction all around him. All Might wasn't going to get his message until Endeavor finished rescuing all the helpless civilians, which would take him about an hour. Knowing this, Izuku shut his eyes and fell asleep, for he was seriously wounded by Endeavor. In his dream, he saw another version of himself on the same rooftop as before. This version of himself wasn't like the original Izuku he had killed before. It was a more scared and fearful version. The scared boy in front of him said, squatting on the ground with his hands over his head and tears falling to the ground. Izuku said to the shivering boy while in little confusion to why he has come across another version of himself. The child before him screamed in fear, making Izuku irritated from his noise. Izuku asked, but not making a difference, for the child wasn't going to stop. Izuku twitched. He screamed louder. He couldn't contain his crying. Izuku warned, pulling a knife from under his arm, walking to the child with twitching hands. "Get away from me," he cried, too scared to move. Izuku twitched and stabbed the child in the back. Izuku yelled and laughed, stabbing him over and over and over again, eventually killing him. Izuku slowly stopped stabbing him as tears began to flow. Izuku paused and dropped the knife in his hand, crying over the melancholy version of himself. Izuku awoke to the feeling of fingers on his cheeks. All Might and Bakugo sat in front of him, trying not to wake him up while they carefully put on the mirrored glasses around Izuku's head, which was almost to his crying eyes. All Might and Bakugo's faces lit up in panic seeing Izuku had awoken. Izuku panicked and pushed All Might back with his foot, making him fall back, but at the same time Bakugo grabbed his throat and pinned him back to the wall with one hand and trying to put the glasses down over his eyes with his other hand. Izuku tried to kick Bakugo back with his other foot, but his position wasn't in Izuku's favor. Izuku watched All Might get back up on his feet behind Bakugo. Bakugo was struggling to get the glasses over Izuku's face because Izuku was trying to pull them off with his hand. All Might grabbed the glasses and helped pull them down to his eyes, but suddenly, in a more of a panic than before, Izuku, from trying to prevent the glasses over his face, he went and forced his fingers into Bakugo's eyes, making him fall back from the pain, then giving Izuku room to heavily kick All Might in his weak spot, which Bakugo was in charge to protect because of the sides they chose to approach Izuku by Izuku's understanding. Izuku jumped behind them as they quickly recovered. He coughed, "Wow, that's really a PP move of you two." Izuku twitched, rubbing the tears from his eyes. He looked at the glasses that they tried so desperately to put on him. "Ah, I understand. A mirror, If I can't see anything, then that would limit 70% of what I can do because most quirks need vision. That's kinda smart. Whose idea was it? Asked Izuku. All Might and Bakugo just stared at Izuku. Very good. You do learn from your mistakes. This battle might actually be fun. Laughed Izuku with a relieved smile on his face. I know that there are others here, won't you come out? Sighed Izuku, rubbing his head. Kirishima, Azui and Ida revealed themselves from behind Bakugo and All Might. Only you three. Is that all? Izuku sighed in disappointment. Izuku noticed that Kirishima stood next to Bakugo and smirked. They all stood and looked at Izuku as he put one hand on his blushing face, waiting for him to make a move. Izuku giggled and blushed, knowing he was about to see the BLD of one of his friends with the pull of a trigger. Izuku smiled, slowly lifting his arm with his hand pointed like a gun. Izuku's hand aimed at Kirishima. His hand suddenly flicked up with the sound of a gunshot. Bakugo turned to his side where the gunshot sounded like it had impacted. Kirishima was falling to the ground before his eyes, bleeding from a gunshot to the head, immediately dead. Smirked Izuku, blowing the end of his finger, watching Bakugo about to catch Kirishima before he falls to the ground. Bakugo grabbed Kirishima and kneed to the ground in shock, beginning to cry. Oh please, really? Izuku rolled his head to crack it as he cracked his fingers at the same time. You push everyone away, why do you care now? He sighed. Bakugo sprung from his spot and went to grab Izuku in anger, but he missed over and over as Izuku dodged carelessly of his attempts. Young Bakugo, stop. All Might yelled out as they all began to hurriedly stumble to stop Bakugo from attacking Izuku. They were still trying to realize Izuku killed Kirishima so easily. Izuku's eyes glowed green as his arms suddenly turned into sharp scythe blades before everyone's eyes. Bakugo stopped and jumped back to see Izuku's transformed arms, knowing that it would be stupid trying to attack such a dangerous quirk. You're not coming for me anymore. Izuku giggled with his eyes infuriatingly staring at him, showing all the sleep under his eyes. Bakugo screamed in pain. Squirming on the ground, Izuku looked down at him with a satisfied look on his face. His scythe arm covered with Bakugo's BLD touched the ground, scraping the ground as he left Bakugo and turned to the others. Izuku flicked his arm at everyone in front of him, flicking small drops of Bakugo's BLD across all their faces. Izuku smiled, seeing All Might with his student's BLD over his face. All Might took a large inhalement of air uneasily. Bakugo screamed in pain besides his own arms. They weren't sure what to do next as Izuku's arms turned to normal. Bakugo needs to exit the battlefield, and the others hiding don't think it's a good time to come out yet. All Might knew he couldn't talk to Izuku either because of having Shinso's quirk. Izuku rolled his eyes. God. Just make a move. Izuku irritated with the tension high. Everyone braced themselves as Izuku started walking down to them, all with his spine changing, cracking and snapping and beginning to bleed as it looked like something was about to come out of his back. Suddenly a gunshot went off. Izuku had been shot in the knee. He fell on his bleeding knee as it was shaking from the pain. His hands twitched. What little bit? Izuku turned around and began to cry in shame and disbelief. He turned his head around and covered his face in his tears. He screamed. All Might tried to identify who shot Izuku's knee from behind him. He went in shock, realizing it was Inko. Inko dropped the gun and covered her mouth in shock of Izuku's behavior. She cried, slowly walking up from behind him. She asked, torturing Izuku's mind apart as he heard those words from his mother. Inko hugged him as he sat paralyzed by the fact that he could hurt his own mother. He began to puff as there was a fight going on in his mind. All Might noticed this when his face quickly twitched from deliriously smiling to the crying Izuku. He thought he lost. All Might cautiously walked over to Izuku with a pair of the mirrored glasses, trying to not make any sudden movements as it might disturb whatever was going on in his mind, which he suspected was another personality battle. Bakugo called out to All Might quietly, trying not to pass out from the pain. All for one, he's here, he called out, turning his head to see a horrid-faced man in a suit calmly walking towards the group. All Might noticed his appearance, and quickly slid the glasses over Izuku's face, secured. Can you get Izuku out of here? All Might asked Inko. She nodded but still quietly cried as she was upset from having to shoot her own son to stop him from harming the people he once cared for. Do not bother, Inko added, finally arriving the battlefield. All Might stood in front of Inko, Todoroki, Shinso and the others jumped out and surrounded All for One. Inko and All Might suddenly rose from the ground and tossed away from Izuku, who was crying and twitching on the ground. Get away from the boy, Ifo sneered, moving them with a flick of his hand while still surrounded by the students. Izuku screamed as his eyes changed colors. Izuku! Everyone screamed out to him in disbelief. Izuku screamed in agony. All Might quickly stood back up as the others attacked AFO as a distraction. Something was wrong with Izuku and he knew AFO knew exactly what was going on with him. He ran up till he could see the air dangerously moving in circles around Izuku. He knew that if he went into the airflow he would be hurt very horrifically just by its speed, so he stuck his fingers in and braced for the pain. He inserted his fingertips into the moving air, and then his arm was furiously flicked back behind him from the force. All Might's 3 fingers, ring finger, pointing finger, and index finger were broken. Izuku was right in front of him, still screaming and bleeding. Inko had been knocked out by the impact of being thrown aside by AFO. All Might clenched his fists to try and prevent them from breaking and began to walk through the hurricane, tearing his shirt to pieces and scratching All Might with the fragments of dust being carried with it. He slowly got closer to Izuku, bearing the pain. He yelled out as he almost got down to Izuku. He yelled as he fell down to Izuku, picking him up and hugging him, making him calm down, ceasing all of the quirks that ran wildly uncontrolled from Izuku. Izuku had tears running from his eyes and sliding underneath the gaps of the mirrored glasses on his head. He huffed and puffed. His temperature was turning hot to cold constantly in All Might's arms. He was sick. All Might yelled out he was so happy to have Izuku back. Everyone smiled in relief. They finally had a win. AFO did not seem to be impressed with what All Might achieved, but he wasn't concerned about Izuku being taken from him once again by the fake father he called All Might. Izuku huffed, hugging All Might, quivering in shock, fear and pain as he could see anything because of the glasses. He replied confidently, striking AFO with a bit of irritation. AFO tried to bring All Might down from his pillar of confidence in himself. The students joined All Might in a stance of a wall, holding Bakugo, Kirishima and Inko in their group. As AFO completely disappeared, All Might hugged Izuku, who started to nod his head, trying to not pass out from his pain. All Might cried in joy. Everyone smiled seeing Izuku back to the hero side. Bakugo even smiled before passing out from loss of BLD out of nowhere. All Might thought back to when Izuku was kidnapped in front of him so easily. At the time everyone's minds were still trying to comprehend the truth of Izuku's father that morning and made them all think irrationally, thinking Izuku was a villain before getting their minds back to pieces to realize that he was just a kid who didn't know what his father was like. Judging someone by who their father is, how disgraceful of us all, he thought to himself, standing up with Izuku in his arms. Izuku said to All Might in a whisper, replying to what he could hear in All Might's head. Izuku coughed. He chuckled listening to his ridiculous description in embarrassment. Izuku's voice cracked. All Might looked down at Izuku's face, looking at his tears mixed with BLD running down his cheeks. All Might said, positioning him so he could wrap his arms around his shoulders. Izuku broke down, hugging All Might. All Might listened to him cry. All Might replied to him, making him feel a little better. Beginning to walk to the ambulance that had just arrived, All Might's fingers shook because they were broken from entering the hurricane that surrounded Izuku before. One of his wrists were dislocated and one of his knees was trying to make him want to collapse, but he tried not to think about it because he knew Izuku would hear his thoughts by one of his new quirks. Aizawa was at the ambulance. He couldn't have been helping in the fight. He knew that sound wasn't going to be good enough in the battle, as much as it pained him to have to stand back and hope for the best. Izuku had been loaded into the ambulance, accompanied by All Might and Aizawa. He reached out his hand and grabbed Aizawa on the arm. "Who is this?" he asked, not being able to see because he still wore the glasses. Aizawa felt Izuku's hand and replied, "It's me, Izuku." Holy hell, did stuff happen in this chapter? Good. XD, don't hate me for what I've done. I promise that the ending will be to your liking. You anyway. So story completion is about 65% to 70%, I'd say. All Might is finally back to himself, laughing face. Everyone loves 𝐷𝐷. Lelmi would like to say thank you all for reading. This story wouldn't be going if I had no one reading it, so to all of y'all, hugs. Next part coming soon, unless you're reading this when it's complete. If so, then it's already there. Mwahaha. Izuku rattled his bed as he twitched left and right in his sleep. He screamed out. He screamed before awakening from his nightmare. Midoriya. You are safe now. Aizawa held him down to his bed by his wrists. Izuku could only his eyes reflection. He was in a soft warm bed. It took him a few seconds to remember what had happened yesterday. He up once he remembered. I am sorry for my racket I must have made just now. Izuku apologized minutes before falling back on the bed. Aizawa laughed and almost cried in joy as he sat back down on the chair that sat next to his resting bed. What's so funny? Izuku asked in curiosity. You're still you, the over-polite child, even with all the hell you've just gone through, he smiled, putting eye drops into his sleepless eyes. Izuku slightly smiled to his reason to laugh. Oh yeah, I'll take them glasses off for you, added Aizawa, stretching over and gently removing his headgear with a special key that is designed only to remove it. Izuku's eyes began to adjust to the light. He could only see half of Aizawa reaching over to him. As he sat down, he put his hand up to his blind eye. I can't see anything. Aizawa looked up at him and held in a surprised reaction. Izuku's blind eye, the eyeball had turned black, but his iris was white. Where is All Might? He asked, putting his hand back down on the bed, not noticing Aizawa's eyes light up in surprisement for that 1 second. The next room over, he's recovering. Aizawa replied. Where's my mum? He asked another question. Further down the hall. She'll be okay, everyone is. Don't worry. Aizawa tried to end his concerns. What happened with Kirishima? Aizawa interrupted Izuku immediately on purpose. Do you understand how your mind works? Izuku noticed what Aizawa was doing. He was fine with it. Taking a deep breath, he spoke. When 𝐒𝐻𝐻 was in control, I could see everything that happened, but I couldn't interact easily. I could only interact with him when he fell asleep. Aizawa listened closely, and so did All Might, who had awoken to his screaming before, listening through the wall. We were always in the same place. It was a rooftop, the rooftop where I learnt the truth about All Might. Every time I met him, I was a little different, more shy, more nerdy. You can understand what I mean. Izuku closed his eyes. For some reason, each trait of me he killed, but when he woke up, that part of me wasn't dead. It's like I was reborn or something when he woke up. I feel different though, as if modified. Modified? Aizawa said back to him. Yeah, my mind feels a little irritated. Which isn't really mean. His eye began to twitch and a smile started to flicker as he listened to himself say the word irritated. Irritated by all of Izuku's hands began to flinch. Aizawa immediately pushed Izuku down back on his bed as he tried to get out. All Might yelled, standing at the door with BLD coming out of his mouth. Izuku calmed down when looking at All Might and realized how his way of thinking changed so quickly, making him cry in shock. Izuku covered his mouth as tears ran down his cheeks. He knew that everything he just said would rub in the fact of they made him think like this. He burst to tears. He cried as Aizawa hugged him. As he broke down, he repeated. All Might walked in and hugged Izuku as well. He began to whisper over and over again, hugging them both back. All Might said to Izuku, screwing this fact firmly into his head, making him cry of joy. Later, Izuku went back to sleep. All Might and Aizawa went to talk each other about Izuku's current state near the door, which was located downstairs, right under Izuku's rest bed. Slowly sneaking into Izuku's room was a curicless boy. Izuku awoke being thrown to the wall, making him spit BLD upon awakening. He coughed horribly, trying to catch his breath. Izuku tried to open his eyes to see who it was, but he was kicked in the stomach, making his eyes close in a natural reflex. Trying to breathe, Izuku asked as he was being kicked over and over again, harder and harder each time, screamed Bakugo, slamming him horrifically into the wall with a fierce kick as a final blow, breaking one of Izuku's ribs and breaking one of Bakugo's toes. Echoed through the hospital, alerting Aizawa and All Might. Izuku coughed BLD all over the floor. Holding his chest in the pain, he looked up to see Bakugo crying but angry. He screamed as All Might and Aizawa rushed in and grabbed Bakugo by his shoulders as he lunged to have another go at hurting Izuku. he cried, relaxing his body. Izuku looked at his face as it waterfalled with tears. He fell on his knees as All Might and Aizawa loosed their grips. Bakugo said in an angry whisper. He slowly turned his head up to look at Izuku in his eyes. He cried with a meaningful look in his eyes. Izuku looked at Bakugo. He stumbled from laying on the floor to up on his knees before him. His mouth started to shake. His voice started to crack. Izuku's heart rose from the bottom of his chest as if all the weights had been removed. Bakugo reached over and hugged Izuku when he showed a saddened smile on his face. It was the first time Bakugo had made Izuku smile. Izuku could feel his other half crying in the back of his mind as well as he. However, smiling with the sight of seeing Izuku cry from a far distance with satisfaction. Okay, so, I feel like we all have traveled a long way to get to this point, or is that just me because I'm the writer? XD oof anyway, hopefully you like this chapter. Made me sad XD, not sure what to talk about 𝐴𝐻𝐽𝐻. I wish Bakugo does end up apologizing for being such an JRK to Izuku in the anime v. We all will look forward to that day, yeah. Oh. So for those of you who don't know this, 𝐼 Season 4 will be out on Saturday, October 12th. 'Tis the official release date, ****. I can't wait to find out what's gonna happen. Don't spoil for me please. I hope we get to see more of Tamaki and LT3. He's so cute in my opinion XD. He ish my even though I know pretty much nothing of him lel anyway again. Next chapter you might have tomorrow. Well, thanks for reading. It's only because people voted, commented, added to read and read that this is still going. Hugs to all my dudes and dudettes. And LT3. Izuku had requested for All Might to be with him at all times and All Might was more than happy to accept that request. All Might's worries about Izuku not wanting to see him anymore were finally put to bed. All Might had been sleeping with Izuku in the hospital like a father with a 4-year-old son, in the same bed. The reason because of this was because of Izuku's dreams which made him kick his legs and his hands flicker, making him use quirks uncontrollably. It was only All Might or Aizawa that would be able to calm him down with their presence. Izuku was destroying beds and screaming when no one he trusted was with him, but when someone he trusts dearly he sleeps either with less destruction or sleeps deeply without movement or sound except for his breath. A special facility had been built for Izuku, hidden away from society. Its location was only known to very few people. Izuku is to be transported now, an army officer said to All Might who waiting for Izuku to wake up from his slumber on his hospital bed. Young Midoriya, All Might rubbed his shoulder, slowly waking him up. Under Izuku's eyes were outlined in black off sleep. This was nothing new. Izuku was and hands cuffed to All Might. Aizawa accompanied them as extra protection against any attacks. There had been attacks on Izuku while he laid in his bed. They had been attempting to kidnap him for his power, but were always stopped by either Aizawa or All Might. Izuku tried not to drift to sleep as he walked with All Might. They both were surrounded by army officers and a few heroes who still had their quirks. Izuku was very weak. During his sleep his own quirks seriously harmed him. Recovery Girl had to heal him every morning. They had to walk to the facility which had been constructed out in the forestry. This was because any transportation truck was too easily seen to be important. It would stand out. There was too much risk if Izuku had been found by villains. "Cease your march," commanded a man walking out before them. "You heroes may leave now. Midoriya is our responsibility now." All Might noticed who the man in front of them was. He was the man who controlled the laws of the heroes. The man who helped build society with heroes. "We will escort Izuku to the facility form here," he added, reaching out his hand waiting for Izuku to be handed over. "It's just a few more meters. We can still walk him there," All Might replied in protection of Izuku. "Don't worry, he'll be safe with us." "You can go home, heroes," the man in his black suit replied, irritated slightly. "No," All Might replied, pulling Izuku close to him, worried that there is more than meets the eye. Aizawa stood next to All Might, putting on his goggles, aware of the strange request for Izuku out of nowhere, especially since they were almost there. "Very well. Follow me." The man turned around. All Might and Aizawa followed cautiously. "What's happening?" Izuku asked in a whisper, for his voice was sore from screaming in his sleep so much. He grabbed his hand, grabbing All Might's finger. "Don't worry, young Midoriya," All Might replied, closing his fist except his pinky finger which Izuku held. They reached the entrance. Izuku's 𝐒𝐬𝐚𝐲 was removed. It's built like a maze so it's not easy to escape or find each other. I will escort Izuku to his room. You heroes are dismissed. This is the most secure facility ever built. All Might noticed Izuku started walking to the entrance after being uncuffed, his eyes staring into the darkness inside, his nose sniffing the aroma coming from inside. Young Midoriya? All Might asked in concern, grabbing his wrist. It's okay, All Might, I won't hurt anyone if I'm here. Izuku smiled at him in relief. All Might's grip loosened and Izuku took his hand out of his grip. I'll visit you every day. All Might yelled out to him as he was inside. He turned around and looked at All Might and Aizawa. See you tomorrow. He waved with a bright smile on his face before the doors closed, separating Izuku from the outside world. All Might walked to a tree and sat down with his arms crossed. Aizawa lifted his eyebrow. What are you doing? He asked in curiosity. All Might replied, closing his eyes. Aizawa laughed. All Might opened one eye and looked at Aizawa. Aizawa sighed and sat down next to him. All Might smiled, irritating Aizawa a little. What? He asked at All Might. Little chuckle. He smiled. Aizawa looked away in embarrassment. All Might bursted out in laughter, spitting out BLD. Meanwhile, Izuku was hunting like a dog, abandoning the people who brought him in. He was searching. There was a scent in the air that drove him crazy. He ran through the maze searching for where the smell was coming from. His speed began to increase as his adrenaline began to speed up when he ran, navigating through the maze. He ran and ran till his legs ceased his rapid movement in an instant, making him fall to the ground, making him dirty. His leg muscles went numb. Izuku looked at his leg. It's like the brain cut off all the commands to his leg. He tried to shake his leg but was distracted by the scent again. It intrigued him dearly. He stood up on one leg because his leg couldn't even let him stand on it. Izuku completely forgot about his leg and ran to find the smell. He finally reached the smell. There was a chair next to a table with a light down on it. Izuku's thoughts came back when he couldn't smell the scent anymore. Said a doctor walking out of the shadows. Izuku panicked. It was the doctor who told Izuku that he didn't have a quirk from when he was only 4 years old. Izuku suddenly fell asleep on the spot. That smell that was bringing you here. If you inhale too much, your body becomes weak. It doesn't take someone who's already weak to faint after only a few sniffs. Said the doctor walking over to Izuku with white clothing in his hand. In Izuku's slumber, he could feel the needles and chemicals being injected into his body. His body began to shake, to tremble uncontrollably. He didn't even have the strength to wake himself up. Some of his nails from his toes and fingers were being ripped off and some of his bones were being dislocated on purpose to see what quirk would fix it. He was a now. The next morning Aizawa woke up to the sound of All Might banging on the door. Open up, he yelled out. Aizawa looked at the skeleton banging on the door with irritation for him making so much noise. Aizawa stood up and sighed. Keep it down, All Might dash. Suddenly a huge creature broke through the door, making Aizawa and All Might fall back to their back from the impact. It flew over their heads and landed in a tree behind them both. They turned around and looked at the creature. Its skin was white, it had a long tail which was part of its spine that stuck out of its skin, one of its hands were just constructed of bones. It jumped down to the ground, its feet were like a hawk's. As it walked its bones snapped and cracked. It was a tall creature but it was skinny and had BLD dripping from its mouth. It began walking away, stumbling side to side. All Might chased after it. Aizawa wasn't sure if he should follow or check on Midoriya. Then men started running out of the door which had been busted open. Aizawa yelled out to them in panic as they caught their breath. A man replied, catching his breath. Aizawa sprinted to follow All Might in that instant. Damn it, he yelled to himself, can't we trust anyone? He thought to himself, catching up to All Might and unraveling his scarf. He managed to catch the creature by its foot when it tried to jump to the trees. Its attention turned to Aizawa and All Might on the ground. It grabbed Aizawa and he was held in its mouth, its teeth piercing Aizawa's skin. Aizawa! All Might panicked. Aizawa replied to then spew out BLD, enduring the pain. All Might took a deep breath and looked at Izuku's eyes while kneeling to the ground, calling out his name. Sorry that the chapter is late. This was longer than usual. I don't think it's that interesting this time round, but it's still okay in my opinion. I kind of feel like I lost it on this chapter. If that just me or not lel xd, but that's just how I feel. I promise I'll have the next chapter. Will be proper. Hope you like it though. Story is about at 80% done, so yeah. Anyway, talk to you later guys. Thanks for your support. Happy face. Next chapter coming soon. And L3. All Might reached out his hand and called out to Izuku, who held Aizawa in his mouth, flattening him slowly with his jaws. He whispered, slowly moving closer to Izuku, who stood alert in front of him. Aizawa coughed out BLD. All Might's fingers brushed past Aizawa's scarf, which was entangled around Aizawa and Izuku's teeth. Izuku's breathing became slow and calm as All Might's fingertips touched the middle of his forehead. Aizawa watched this happen. He was amazed at how All Might attended to the situation, so calm and steady. Izuku's body started to change back to a little boy again, placing Aizawa gently on the ground. Izuku's eyes seemed dead once again. Tears flowed from his eyes, but his eyes showed a different expression. They seemed hopeless. All Might assisted Aizawa with his wounds when Izuku sat down at a tree with his arms crossed, falling asleep almost immediately. Aizawa took of his shirt, allowing All Might to wrap his scarf around him as a bandage. Care to inform me of that trick? Aizawa's eye twitched. All Might replied to him as he hurried, wrapping his scarf around him. It's not the first time young Midoriya has shapeshifted. He has done it in his sleep sometimes. All Might tied a knot and helped Aizawa up. Izuku had fallen asleep, not surprising them. Dadzawa, we gotta take him to Inko. We can hide out there when they stop looking for Izuku. He'll be a fugitive of the government now. All Might said, picking Izuku up. Aizawa froze. What did you just call me? He said with his eyes glowing red and his hair hovering about him. Izuku was only half asleep and half awake. He made a chuckle hearing the conversation between them both, catching both of their attention. They began to walk, proceeding to Izuku's home. Don't ever call me that again, Aizawa angered, kicking a rock with half his face hidden in the remains of his scarf wrapped around his shoulders. It was 10 p.m. Inko answered the door to see two hooded men, which were All Might and Aizawa. All Might had Izuku tucked away under his jumper, hidden from sight except his face, which could only be seen through the hood. They both rushed inside as Inko realized they had Izuku. My baby Izuku, she whispered into Izuku's eye as she held him in tight to her as he still slept. After the retrieval of Izuku being back from AFO, the plan was to have him go back to Inko, but his sleeping problems would be a danger to her. Izuku was laid into his bed and tugged in by All Might before walking out to meet Inko and Aizawa waiting for him in the lounge room. Is Izuku okay? She asked, twiddling her thumbs. No, he's sick. Aizawa cut straight to the chase. All Might sighed at Aizawa for just going straight out with an answer and not with a slow 𝐒𝐻𝐿VOI. He is sick, but he won't die, All Might added before Inko went into a panic. He hasn't had his other personality interfere for a while, but that doesn't mean that he's not still there. Izuku is sick because he has many quirks that are interfering with each other. Only the other Izuku could control its flow. Inko interrupted Aizawa. I don't understand, her voice trembled. Let's say that the other side of Izuku had many cups of food coloring. He is able to keep the colors in separate cups, All Might said, whereas the Izuku right now has all of the colors in one cup, Aizawa added. And each color is a quirk, Izuku added, walking out from his bedroom and into the kitchen with bags under his eyes. Izuku grabbed a cup as the kettle, coffee jar, sugar and a spoon moved over to Izuku's direction in midair. He looked down with objects flying to and away from him as he made his coffee. All Might and Aizawa was surprised Izuku was even up, even though he looked exhausted. Izuku closed his eyes, took a sip of his coffee as items were placed back to where they were lifted up from. Inko, All Might and Aizawa looked at Izuku befuddled. What did he just say? They asked themselves. Izuku placed his cup down and let out a sigh of relief. He opened his eyes to see a strange look on everyone's faces. Izuku asked, lifting his eyebrow with his pale, bagged eyes. I'm not joking. Izuku flicked his hair that covered his forehead back. Izuku sighed before walking back into his bedroom to change into something clean. All Might stood up and walked over to Izuku, trying to still comprehend what Izuku said he was going to do to his father. Those words of Izuku came into his head as he opened the door to see Izuku about to grab a new shirt. All Might saw a huge scar running down Izuku's back as he was about to put on a clean shirt. All Might asked, seeing how horrific it was. Izuku listened to All Might's question and remembered the day he helped kill All Might's teacher. He paused halfway to reaching his jumper. Izuku's voice cracked. Izuku's tone in his voice changed and grabbed his jumper and a cap. Izuku pushed past All Might as he stood in shock in the doorway. His hands shook and Izuku put on his jumper as he walked through the door. Aizawa saw All Might standing still quivering and immediately noticed something was wrong. Aizawa grabbed his wrist as he walked to the door. "Aizawa, let me go, you can't stop me." Izuku sighed, looking back at him from the corner of his eye. Aizawa noticed Izuku's eyes now shone green. Aizawa commanded. All Might had his hand over his mouth, trying not to let Izuku hear him cry quietly. Izuku knew that All Might believed the fact he helped kill her. The reason for Izuku being a helper that day was just to harm All Might in the future, this very moment. Izuku's glowing eyes shifted from looking down at Aizawa to All Might, who still stood in his bedroom doorway. "It's okay to cry, All Might," Izuku said to him quietly. All Might grabbed his shirt. Izuku looked away at All Might, using a quirk to make him untouchable, almost like a ghost. This made Aizawa let go of his wrist. Izuku walked out the door and All Might still stood clenching his arm to the side of the doorway. Aizawa walked up behind All Might and pat his shoulder, waking him up from his standstill. "Izuku is walking away, we should follow him." Aizawa smiled uneasily. Inko rushed out of the house and ran out to Izuku, who almost disappeared into the night. She called out. Izuku's head jolted up as he forgot something which stood behind him. He turned around to face her, pulling out something from his pocket. Izuku cried as he held out a gun and pointed it at Inko. He cried, pulling the trigger. All Might and Aizawa ran out to see Inko falling backwards in front of the doorway before them with a bullet in her head. They both looked to the left to see Izuku dropping the gun with tears in his eyes, turning away and disappearing into the darkness of the night. Izuku warned. I really wasn't happy with the chapter that I did before this one. XD, I'm gonna call it my worst chapter lol. 3 anyway, I made up for it with this chapter. Very good jajajajajajaja. Also boss fight coming XD. I wonder what I can think of in the fight scene. I've already got some awesome ideas, so don't worry. I'm not storyless yet. XP, I already know how I'm gonna end it, so yet 3 OMG, the story is so close to being finished. It's about 88% to 90% done. I'm getting excited. XD, are you? I used to listen to Five Nights at Freddy's songs when I first came to the online world of music, so I've just came back to it all today, and it's very good to listen to when writing this story. It's ridiculous. XD, y'all on anywho, thank you for reading. I'm amazed how this story has gone since the day I put it up. Thank you everyone for your support and encouragement on this. Like, it really means a lot to me because I tend to be unsure of myself about certain things. Hugs out to all of ye. And LT. 3 talk to ya next time. Love ye all. Aizawa grabbed All Might as he leapt up to chase after Izuku. Let me go, Aizawa. All Might looked at him, confused for why he was holding him back. Don't follow, we will meet him later on. He killed Inko so she wouldn't disturb him in battle like before. He would have killed us too, but he didn't. Aizawa explained to All Might. All Might had a concerned but sad look on his face. He replied, his hand forward to remove Aizawa's grip. Aizawa called out to him as he walked away. All Might ceased his steps, listening to Aizawa. Aizawa said, making All Might stay put. All Might sighed to himself, looking up to the stars. Izuku wiped off his tears that ran off his emotionless face, then enter an abandoned warehouse. Ufo glanced at Izuku, who was entering through the broken front doors. Izuku replied, looking back at his father, who stared at him from a railing above. Ufo smiled, walking around and down to Izuku. Izuku just glanced back with his dreadful eyes. Ufo was interrupted by Izuku. Ufo replied. Izuku didn't answer. Sneered Ufo. Izuku replied with a slight spark of anger in his eyes. Ufo sighed. Ufo turned around and began to walk away from Izuku. He asked. Izuku had triggered a gun, but the bullet was stopped by one of Ufo's quirks. Izuku interrupted his father. He sneered as his eyes glowed green, dropping the gun on the ground before he sprung at Ufo. A huge explosion with lightning went off in the distance. That's Izuku, we gotta go now. All Might saw a huge cloud of smoke in the distance. Aizawa and All Might ran to the scene and hid behind rubble. Izuku had one of his ankles completely bloodied, twisted and bent, which reminding Aizawa of his injuries when he fought the Noma back at the UF. Izuku had BLD running down his arm. He had used all for one but not damaged himself. Fo on the other hand shook his wrist as he had countered Izuku in the chest. Izuku's breathing was heavy, his movement was still fast however, fueled by his adrenaline. He leapt once again, ignoring his busted leg, trying to grab his father's face but only to be avoided. As AFO dodged Izuku's counter attempt, Izuku's body direction began to twist to make a quirk's sudden change in attack style. His fingertips started to turn black as he aimed towards AFO's body. Izuku grabbed his hand with his other hand and braced himself. Izuku's blind eye emitted black smoke and his other eye glowed green, emitting lightning as his fingers blasted out a huge combination of quirks at AFO, hitting him directly, but throwing Izuku and AFO kilometers apart from each other with the tremendous blast. AFO was too far away to see how injured he was, but Izuku still could stand strong. All Might glared at Izuku, looking as his fingers that tore up half the city in a single explosion. His fingertips were shredded, you could the bloodied bones of his fingers between the gaps of his torn flesh. All Might whispered from still in hiding. Izuku replied, not taking his eyes off AFO, who was getting out of the rubble in the far distance, only to Izuku's eyes. All Might and Aizawa remained hidden as AFO slowly floated back towards Izuku. Half of AFO's face was blown off, along with an arm dislocated and sitting over his shoulder's blades. AFO said, fixing his arm while half-head was regenerating. Izuku started to ready himself again as AFO landed on the ground. AFO suddenly was in front of Izuku with the blink of an eye. He tried to escape but AFO grabbed him and threw him on his stomach without hesitation. AFO said as Izuku struggled to escape his holding. After a few minutes, Izuku gave up struggling and put his head down flat on its side. As his face sat on the dirt, he saw All Might and Aizawa awaiting for him to give them an opening. He could also hear a group of footsteps coming from a distance. Izuku knew it was the rest of his classmates coming to help him in his battle. AFO suddenly snapped Izuku's elbow, making him scream in pain and lose his train of thought. AFO laughed. Izuku's eyes glowed again and frustration showed in his face. Izuku purposely broke his spine as bent his legs back and grabbed his father at his head, and locked his head in between his legs. Izuku threw his father head first into the ground with the powerful throw of his legs. Izuku puffed as he stood up with his humped back. He puffed. Izuku spat out a tooth. Izuku said as AFO sat up with his bloody face covered in dirt. The atmosphere changed as Izuku's face turned back to a delirious smile as he allowed his other to take over. He ran his damaged fingers through his hair and sighed with a pestered smiling face. Izuku's eye twitched, glaring down at his father. Izuku said, straightening his back, bearing the pain. AFO stood up, clicking his jaw into place. AFO replied. Izuku had a ready stance and AFO had his hands ready to deflect whatever Izuku would try to do next. Izuku pounced at AFO, aiming to grab his arm. AFO flicked his finger, releasing a whirlwind of air to try and make Izuku back down, but Izuku slid down between his legs. Izuku was already on his feet and grabbed his AFO's arm as he turned around to attack. Izuku grinned, enjoying the acceleration of the fight. Sinking his fingers into AFO's arms, he stabbed AFO with a knife to his throat. AFO panicked and used his other arm to throw Izuku away. He said, pulling the knife out his throat. Izuku laughed as he lifted his head up at his father. He held up his hand that still had his fingers heavily indented in AFO's arm. He pulled off AFO's arm. Izuku laughed, throwing AFO's arm at him as a distraction. Izuku lunged at AFO from above. He added Bakugo's explosion, Dabi's flames, Todoroki's ice, and One for All's unique strength to his legs. AFO lifted his hand to hold back Izuku as his legs were ready to swing at him. With a big shine of lightning, Izuku broke his leg in half with the incredible impact of his kick. Izuku fell to his side as he had no feet to land on. Izuku looked back at AFO with half an arm. AFO said, admiring the damage Izuku did to his arm. Izuku tried to drag himself away as AFO slowly began to walk towards him. Hearing his father, he turned around and tried to use quirks to making him stop, but it was not effective. AFO threw pipes from the rubble into Izuku's thighs and arms to make him stop moving. AFO laughed as he kneed down, about to place his hand on his head. AFO placed his hand on Izuku's head and used his erasing memory quirk. making Izuku scream and squirm. That foe sneered as the quirk only worked on Izuku for 3 seconds. Aizawa sneered back with his scarf hovering over his shoulders with his hair floating above his sleepless eyes. All Might stood next to Aizawa. All Might said, readying his fists. All Might ran at AFO as Aizawa stared at him, trying not to blink for dear life. AFO quickly stood up and put his foot on Izuku's chest. All Might's body shifted to a muscular tall man with one punch ready to be thrown. Fo smiled. AFO lifted his other foot off the ground, leaving Izuku's chest being crushed by his father's body weight. All Might punched AFO in the face, making him fly through the broken buildings. All Might referred back to his weak, fragile form and looked down at Izuku, who had his heart and lunges exposed. He spat out BLD in the last moments of him taking gasps of air. All Might screamed, releasing him from the pipes that held him down. All Might grabbed Izuku up to his chest, hugging him tightly as his body was lifeless in his arms. All Might hugged Izuku, rocking him back and forth. Aizawa watched All Might hug dead Izuku. Aizawa reached for All Might's shoulder but paused. All Might repeated, holding Izuku firmly. Aizawa stared at Izuku's lifeless eyes. He was still trying to swallow the fact that Izuku was dead. All Might held Izuku close and lied to himself one last time. Howdy doody, #1, Dante hate me XD. It's all part of Death Story. It's about 95% done, so very close XD. I'm a bit worn out, so I'm not gonna say much in this editors to readers ting, but yeet. Next chapter coming soon later this week. Also, your daily hugs y'all ****/ thanks for reading as always. See you in the next chapter. And LT 3 FO walked up to All Might and Aizawa. He smiled, looking at the devastation in their eyes. All Might sneered as tears dropped onto Izuku's shoulder. Sighed AFO. All Might immediately stood up and went to throw a punch at AFO with his fragile body. AFO caught All Might's fist with his one hand. AFO smiled as All Might clenched his other fist and swung at AFO again. The rest of the UA students showed up. Bakugo saw All Might punch AFO in the face, standing over Izuku, who was dead on the ground. Everyone stood quietly, their legs and arms shook. Bakugo slowly crept forward, staring at Izuku's body. Aizawa noticed Bakugo trembling onto the battlefield. These thoughts went through Aizawa's mind before he stared back at AFO. Aizawa realized how AFO dodged All Might's attacks. It was as if he knew what All Might would do before he would then it hit him. Aizawa yelled out to All Might. Aizawa looked down at Izuku's dead body. All Might took his eyes off AFO for a millisecond to notice Bakugo walking to Izuku's dead body. In that moment of All Might looking away, he grabbed him by the throat. That foe's grip tightened around his throat, making All Might start to gasp for air. Aizawa immediately acted, directing his scarf over to FO as he sprinted, ignoring Bakugo, who was just reaching Izuku, too shocked to pay attention to what was happening around him. Aizawa ordered, snapping Bakugo out of his trance. FO watched as Aizawa and his scarf was about to reach All Might. AFO's arm had finished regenerating and he held his hand up and put his fingers in a flick position. He flicked his finger and released hurricanes of air, throwing Aizawa back far into a wall of rubble, making his head slam it fiercely. The impact made him dizzy. Aizawa spat BLD as he fell to his stomach. He looked up, holding himself up by his elbows. He yelled, trying to get up even though he was seeing waves of sight. The foe smiled, letting All Might fall to the ground by the release of his grip. All Might grabbed his throat, rubbing it from the pain of AFO's strangle. All Might repeated back. He looked back at Izuku, who was being carried on Bakugo's shoulders, almost completely off the battlefield. Bakugo was shocked out of his mind. It was written all over his face. He then looked at Aizawa, who was shaking, just trying to sit up straight. All Might smiled as a tear ran down his face. He laughed. Aizawa rose up in panic as AFO put his hand on All Might's skull. Aizawa screamed, stumbling up to his feet in a rush. He screamed, throwing his scarf to catch him. Time slowed down for everyone at that moment. Bakugo and the rest of the students watched from the sidelines as Aizawa sprinted at All Might. All Might raised his hand up at Aizawa, giving him a thumbs up. All Might smiled. Aizawa cried. All Might's last tears fell off from his chin. AFO smiled and exploded All Might's head into bits, scattering BLD everywhere. Across Aizawa's, Izuku's and Bakugo's face, Aizawa paused in his track and fell to his knees as All Might's body fell to the ground. Izuku suddenly took a huge gasp of air and struggled out of Bakugo's arms. His chest was still penetrated, he wasn't healing but he didn't feel pain either. Izuku coughed and looked up to see Aizawa looking at him with tears running down his shattered face. Izuku looked over to Ifo and saw All Might lying on the ground. Hubata. Howdy doody, you know when your writing is working when you're crying about your own story, ouch. The pain is like 3 or 2 chapters away from being finished. I think I'll update tomorrow so you won't wait long for the next chapter. Thanks for reading. And thanks for your support. Here's your daily hug. /winky face into 3. Aizawa stood up, trying to walk straight to Izuku. He grabbed Izuku's arm, lifting him off the ground. He wiped off his tears before picking Izuku up. Izuku tried to push himself out of Aizawa's arms as they ran away from AFO with the students. More tears went down Aizawa's face as Izuku yelled out to All Might. Izuku didn't know he was dead, he thought he was unconscious. Izuku became frustrated as Aizawa ignored him. He yelled. Aizawa annoyed him, speeding up his pace. Izuku clenched his fist and yelled once again. He punched Aizawa in the cheek, making him fall of his balance from his head still being dizzy. BLD ran out of Aizawa's nose. Aizawa saw Izuku grab a piece of wood that would have been off a table that was destroyed along with many buildings in his fight. Izuku tuned to assess his twisted leg. He grabbed it and twisted it back into place, making him sigh in pain a second after. He then attended to his other leg, which was only half a leg. He took the piece of wood and prepared himself for the pain before he jammed it into his leg, running up aside his leg's bone. Izuku angered at Aizawa. Aizawa yelled as Izuku started stumbling back to AFO, who was waiting and watching for Izuku's return. Izuku stopped, taking a deep breath as he braced himself for an immediate attack. He listened to his heartbeat, along the others around him. Green electricity emitted from his body as he looked at All Might, who laid on the ground beside Ifo. Before Ifo knew Izuku had even made a move, he was in front of him, his fingers with sharpened nails digging into his shoulder blades, grabbing them, piecing even the bone. AFO panicked at Izuku's incredible overwhelming speed and tried to punch him back before his arms were discarded from his body, only to be too slow and have both his arms ripped off. Ifo took a step back and looked up at Izuku, only to see his arms falling to the ground and no one there. Suddenly he felt both his legs melt as if all of his leg's strength was gone. Izuku had dislocated every bone in his legs, toes to hip. Ifo was in the air for a split second from no legs able to hold him up. Izuku appeared hovering above him, with his arm ready to throw a punch. Izuku's eyes glowed of all for one rainbow. Ifo yelled at Izuku. One hand regenerated quickly to try and stop Izuku's punch. Izuku hit his father's suddenly regenerated hand, punching through it and punching him straight in the forehead, slamming him straight into the dirt. As the storms of dust settled, Izuku was sitting on his father with one arm, a twisted leg, and the other with a stick in it. Breathing was heavy, and as his adrenaline slowed down he began to feel all of the pain he was in, but he wasn't done yet. He used his last limb, his arm, to punch into AFO's chest as he laid helpless, also puffing in exhaustion and pain. Izuku grabbed each and every last one of his father's ribs, crushing them slowly, making him suffer before he died. Izuku angered, grabbing AFO's heart and slowly gently pulling it out of his chest. AFO laughed, watching Izuku putting the heart up to his mouth. He smiled as Izuku took a huge bite out of his father's beating heart. Izuku chewed it with a disgusted look on his face from the taste. He watched his father die as he swallowed his heart with the BLD all over his mouth. Izuku made sure to consume every piece of AFO's heart, leaving no piece behind no matter how horrible it tasted. Tears slowly dribbled over his face, but his expression was calm. He felt his arm and legs begin to regenerate, but his chest, exposing his flattened heart and lunges, left exposed, painless. Aizawa walked up to Izuku. He was about to ask a question until Izuku replied, standing up off his father's dead body. Izuku looked at Aizawa and then looked at All Might, who laid on the ground only a few meters away. Izuku walked over to his real father. Izuku tore off a piece of his heart and put it in All Might's mouth, forcing the dead man to swallow. Aizawa gasped in amazement as All Might's hand twitched as his body started regenerating just like Izuku's did. All Might sat up and coughed, gasping for air. He looked at Izuku who had blood all over his mouth. All Might panicked thinking he was dreaming. Izuku hugged All Might. Izuku said trying not to be a crybaby. Aizawa smiled as All Might sat in shock to hear those words. All Might hugged back trying to not cry either. Izuku got up a few minuets after. His classmates surrounded him as the sun rose. He reached his hand to the sky and closed his eyes. Izuku clenched his fists together, bringing down several stars in front of them all, making small craters in the ground. Izuku smiled, placing his hand back behind him to help him up with a smile on his face. The stars began to move. Izuku said to himself once again as All Might stood beside him. Kirishima, Inko, Tamura, Dabi, Toga, twice, Kurogiri, all of the villains, heroes and family Izuku killed except his father rose from the craters. Izuku proposed. All Might noticed someone very dear to him stand up at the back of the group. She had appealing long black hair and stunning gray eyes. All Might gasped and Tamura turned around to see her behind him, shedding tears realizing who it was. Hubata. Howdy doody. Correction. One chapter left XD. I'm satisfied with this chapter, 3 and my whole book lel, 3 wow 1 chapter. I'm 1 chapter wow XD. I'm taking a minute to take into fact in so close with all thanks for reading. And LT, 3 here's your daily hug ******, as All Might walked up to his teacher Bakugo grabbed Izuku's shoulder, pulling him back to punch him. Izuku wasn't intending to dodge even though he could have. You idiot. Don't you dare die you DMN nerd. I'll kill you if you die. He yelled as Izuku who recovered from Bakugo's punch. Bakugo's fists shook in frustration as Izuku looked back at him and smiled, understanding how he felt. I'm sorry he said scratching his cheek. A few days had passed after AFO's death. Aizawa hit All Might over the head as he walked up behind him. He was about to open the door into his class. What was that for? All Might sighed with a puzzled face. Aizawa hid half his face in his scarf. I told you not to call me 𝐷𝐴𝐷𝐿. He angered, slipping his hand back into his pocket. All Might knew he was referring to what he said before he died. He laughed and smiled. Sorry Aizawa. He opened the door to see his students, Izuku sitting happily in his chair, talking to himself, literally. All Might and Aizawa began the day's lessons. All Might had been learning how to be a proper teacher from his teacher, Nana, guiding him every step of the way. All Might didn't spit out blood anymore either. Because of swallowing Izuku's heart, he gained immortality. Izuku and All Might couldn't feel pain except if it was emotional, meaning All Might could go back to his muscular form for as long as he wanted, being the symbol of peace. However, the fact of immortality, the fact that he would see the world at its worst and at its best for thousands of years, not being able to rest in peace didn't sit well with him. He wanted to see Izuku finally take over his role with his help before passing, but not live forever. All Might knew that he'd have to ask Izuku to let him die, and Izuku knew that too. Inko, right after her resurrection, she wasn't talking to Izuku the same way as she used to. She was still trying to figure out how she felt. The fact that Izuku killed her without hesitation wounded her deeply. She still supported Izuku as always, but she just needed time for her death to pass. All Might always visited her every night to make sure she was doing okay. Izuku had given everyone their quirks back, however, still having their quirks himself. He was in control almost all of the time due to having help from the owners of his quirks on how to use his new abilities properly. He accepted to be called Izuku again with the help of Todoroki, and Todoroki's father. Endeavor started to learn how to be a decent father to Todoroki and Dabi. Izuku communicated to his other half through his mind. He wasn't sure about what to do with his other half. He occasionally let him take control of his body for a while, but he never wanted to do anything, so it was really the normal Izuku around. An evil personality with no goal in his life. They couldn't be separated from each other because it would destroy his mind. The only thing they would do is talk to each other, which was fine with them both. Bakugo was being taught by Izuku every afternoon. He was learning about how he could be a nicer person, and he taught Izuku how to get as pro-material as he could be. At the beginning, Bakugo refused to have his quirk returned to him, which Izuku suspected was him feeling horrible about what he did to him when he was quirkless. Izuku forced Bakugo to take back his quirk, which pissed him off, and he chased Izuku over the academy trying to make him take it back. Tomura was getting emotionally better by hanging out with Nana more and more every day. FO had shaped him horrifically in the mind. Tomura thought life was war. All Might and Izuku spent every Friday sparring with each other on their beach. All Might taught Izuku fighting strategies. Aizawa and Shoto would join to spar with them for extra practice. Izuku won the sports festival with just physical ability on the second year at UA, and his popularity grew as big as All Might, making All Might a proud father. Howdy doody. Habadoo. Not much happened in this chapter, but there's not much to happen. LOL, not to brag, but I've been getting about 200 reads a day, and my biggest was 600 a day. Hopefully it will be one of those stories where you will come back to and reread. And LT. 3, please, tell me what your favorite moment was. What was your favorite chapter? If you would rate it, what would it be? I'm actually really sad that this is the ending. There's been a lot of you looking out for the next chapter every day. And LT. 3, thank you again for being there. And LT. 3, if you'd like to ask me questions, then just comment below and I will answer. Smiley face. It will take me a little while to think of how I'm going to structure the villain All Might storyline, so that may take me a few weeks. I'm going to enter this story into the Wattpad Fanfiction Awards thingy, so wish me luck. And LT. 3, if you want to know a little about my life, then I'll just link you to my Instagram. All I do in my life is art. XD link is in me bio's 3, my latest art piece. Again, thank you for your support, guys. And LT. 3, your daily hug / winky face / by everyone. And LT. 3, D. Do you think everyone hates me? Izuku asked as All Might choked on his drink from Izuku, displaying his impression of All Might's face moments before his sudden question. What do you mean? All Might replied, putting down his drink on the office table. Izuku looked down at his scarred hands. I've killed and then revived classmates, family members, and random citizens. You can't just forgive someone for doing something that horrific, he said with a shamed face as he thought of how everyone looked at him lately. Do you regret reviving them? All Might asked. No. Izuku replied, immediately making All Might smile. Then your response proves that you weren't intent on killing them. Remember, young Midoriya, that wasn't the real you. Everyone knows that. Just because I wasn't intent doesn't mean everyone will feel the same way towards each other. Izuku replied with nervousness in his voice. Everyone is going to feel off for a few years, sure, but everyone understands that it's more painful for you than on them. All Might replied with a slight worried face as Izuku starred back. What about you, All Might? The fact that my admiration for you is fake is a much bigger thing for you to live with than it is for me. Izuku's head bent down, his hair hiding his eyes. All Might gulped. He didn't know how to respond to that. He didn't even know how Izuku knew that his admiration is fake. Who told you that? That's not don't lie. Izuku interrupted All Might. We both know it's true. All Might, you can't run from that fact forever despite how hard you try to lock it away. It's always in your face every time you look at me. Izuku's teeth chattered. I can't stop admiring you. Everything you do is so amazing. I can't think about one bad thing I don't admire about you. No matter what I do, I can't stop it. All Might hugged Izuku, who was trying not to cry. You don't have to save me again, young Midoriya. I deserve this. All Might said with shiver in his voice as their conversation pierced each other's hearts like spears. Izuku hugged All Might back, scared of what All Might would say after his next question. All Might inhaled and exhaled with intense shiver in his voice, as this was the hardest thing to say. Despite the fact Izuku knows the truth, he just needed to hear it for himself. Izuku Midoriya, a fake child, a fake hero, a fake successor, a fake son. Howdy doody y'all, ish been too long, so hugs cause I good at those now cause I've been doing them all through the book. Lel, thought of this last night in bed, so surprised. Lel, so yeah, made you cry some more. I know I am a beach-exed. I've been thinking about doing a book number 2, but it will probably be after or during a specific arc, not the overhaul arc. The WHP sound area in the manga. Lel, manga readers get meh. Also dude, people scare me. 44k reads on this book. I mean, that's scary. Lel, I'd have some pressure on the next book. LMAO. Okay, now not to sound like an extremely lonely person, but I have no friends. IRLXD. I've seen that there are some Australians reading the story, so if you in Queensland /QLD PM me and let's see if we can get a friendship going. Note. Even if you're not Australian, I'll still be your friend. Lel, let's see what else. Oki Media Updates. I got TikTok now so if you want a face reveal and GT, and it. Studio on TikTok. Also can y'all support my art on Instagram cause I'm a bit underrated XD. Well, in my opinion I am Lel Heyray, so whip of one I'm doing R, and if you're interested, the link to my profile is in my bio if you are interested. Tank Wu and LT3 going to Supernova Brisbane, 9th Saturday. This year dressed as Tamaki Amajiki / Sun Eater. Warning. I'm crazy for Tamaki Lel, so I hope to meet you there. Other than all that, I think I'm officially done with this book now. LMAO have started a villain Shinso, but im chilled ASF with Write It. Lel started a Miratama medieval story too. Yek, a shippic. It gets extremely different to what I've been writing XD, but Ima try Lel Oki. That's all from this book unless I think of something else before falling asleep at 3 a.m. again. Lel have a picture of Izuku and a picture of my precious Tamaki baby and LT3, the only person you'll find on my Instagram story. Lel. I love ya peeps, and LT3 hugs and stay fucking beautiful. And LT3 Book 2 title, Return of the Dead, can be found by going to my profile. Chapter 1 is released and ready to be read. Updates will try to be consistent. Celebration for 100k reads. TSM plot. You have read this story, hopefully LMAO, and have knowledge of Izuku's two personalities. The personality of a killer and his personality of a hero, but what really happened in that personality battle? Lies are beginning to overwhelm and truths are revealed. I hope you'd like to read part 2. And probably cry all over again. Author person.